It comes and goes. We're out here chasing a
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feels Out Loud, brought to you by Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness. This is your host, Becky McNattin, along with host Tara Martini. We are so glad to have you listening as we live and share stories of mental health. And we have a really cool show today, Tara.
So cool. I'm so excited for this one. And we've never had two guests.
Never.
And 4 of us in this room. So this is some solid girl time.
We are joined by Amy Gold, and is it Danielle Sorenson?
Yes.
Thank you both for being here today. We are so excited to have you. Tara and I asked you both to come on the show because we wanted to process through the ways in which mental health has changed over the course of decades and how mental wellness is impacted differently in different generations. Amy, you're in your 60s. Danielle, you're in your 20s. Tara and I are both in our 40s.
Yep.
So it's going to be really interesting to explore this topic together. But before we get started, I wanted to give the caveat to all of our listeners that everyone here is just individuals. Of course, we can't speak to an entire generation. But we can start the conversation and inspire all of you who are listening today to talk with people in your lives about ways mental health is lived out differently based on age and generation. So, Amy and Danielle, tell us a little bit about yourselves. Amy, start first.
Oh, gosh. I'm 60 years old. So I'm in the baby boomer generation.
Yes.
I'm a marriage and family therapist. I work at Becoming Together Therapy
Yay.
and Wellness.
Mm-hmm.
So I know Tara and Becky, but I don't know Danielle. So it's so good to meet you, Danielle. I've been married 31 years. I have a 24-year-old, going to be 24-year-old son.
So you also see how there's another generation and how they've lived out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Danielle's
With your son.
around my son's age, even.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for sharing. Danielle, how about you? Tell us about you.
Yeah, I'm Danielle. I'm 25 years old. I'm not married.
Okay.
But, I'm an actuary. I've been, working for about 4 years now. So that transition is all fairly new to me still.
Okay.
So that's been very interesting, kind of moving into that piece and how mental health has impacted me there, college, all that kind of stuff.
Great.
Of course, because that's a big job.
Yeah.
That's a lot of responsibility for someone in their 20s.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
not just like entry level,
Well, yeah, and they don't teach you most of that stuff in college. It's like, all right, we're going to give you all the good skills that you need. Now you can go apply them. And I'm like, how do I do that?
Yes. Yeah, that's big.
Well, so as we get started today, in let's say 2 words for you two, we're talking about feels today, all through the show. And as you were growing up, was it okay to talk about feelings and emotional experiences? Amy, you start.
No.
Okay. All right.
I would say it was, I say no, but only in that it just wasn't talked about, like mental health, feelings, especially with kids. It was
kind of an uncharted conversation.
Yes, just not there.
And Danielle, what would you say?
I'd say there's definitely more, you were able to talk about it more. There was a lot more education around it.
Okay.
But it was about who you would talk to about it was kind of the bigger issue, I think.
Okay.
That's a good point.
So really good point on the differences in those generations of not only it was okay to talk about, but maybe with only certain people.
Yeah.
And Tara, what would you say in your generation?
Great question. I would say, from what I remember about my childhood, that when I was younger, not so much, but the older I got, and I remember being able to be open about it once I hit college age and having more open conversations with my parents, but still having it be pretty, not secretive, but people did not talk about it openly in college like we see 20-something-year-olds or our clients who come in and are so much more open about it.
I would say in my world, feelings were okay to talk about as long as they were something of the past and something you got through.
Ooh.
Resilience. But great discussion here. I'm so excited to talk about this all. We're going to take a short commercial break, but stay tuned for more discussion with our panel on the experiences of mental health through the decades. We are so glad to have you listening. We'll be back in a moment.
Welcome back to Feels Out Loud, brought to you by Becoming Together Therapy and Wellness. I am Tara Martini, along with the fabulous Becky McNattin, along with two fabulous guests today. So let's dive right back into mental health through the generations.
Okay, everybody. There are some massive differences in mental health depending on the generation that you are part of. Research shows that Gen Z, so Danielle, where you all are, report higher rates of mental health issues, but they're more open to discussing them. So that would get at that part that we talked about in the last segment. Baby boomers, you, Amy, may experience higher stigma in seeking mental health care, which would highlight willingness to talk about the topic. And there are huge perspective differences in whether mental health issues are more common now or whether things are just diagnosed more frequently. Generational stressors certainly are different, and the ways that we respond to emotional needs is different. So we have a lot to talk about in the next little bit here. And as we get started, I would love to hear more about how mental health was modeled for you. And Danielle, would love for you to start.
Yeah. I'll be honest, probably wasn't modeled the best for me. I have some people in my family who have not had phenomenal mental health, paths in their life. But I'd say that also made me more aware of those kinds of things. So you see someone going through something and you're like that, and you're like, how do you help that person? How do you help that person? You're like, oh, wait, I actually have some of those same emotions. And so that's when I think, when you start making some connections like that, I wouldn't say my parents, they didn't really talk about it a lot, but I have two older sisters and they were my outlets for literally everything. I call my older sister for every single minor convenience in my life. Poor girl, she deals with so much.
I love that you have her.
Yes,
Yeah,
me
totally.
too. Me too.
And now is your sister significantly older or closer to your age?
Yeah, we actually have a pretty big age gap. So my oldest sister is 11 years older than me.
Okay.
So she is 35, almost 36.
Okay.
And my other sister is 6 years older than me. So she is 30, almost 31.
So even a different generation than you, then they would fall into that millennial generation.
Yep.
Amy, what about you? How would you say mental health was modeled for you?
It's funny, right? Because it's personally and then generationally, like how it was modeled. Like when I think about back in my day in the 60s and 70s growing up, mental health wasn't even really a phrase. It wasn't that there was a school therapist in your school. It was you went to the nurse or, kept it to yourself, whatever, and then personally though, I had a loving mother, stay-home mom. My father went to work.
So it's very traditional in the sense of that time period.
Yeah, in that generation. But it wasn't so much about your feelings, although I was, as I am today still, someone that likes to talk all about her day. And I would come home after school. I totally remember this about talking about feelings. Every day after school, and I come home and I just assume my mom was waiting for me to tell her about my day, and I would just talk and talk. And then I came home one day and there was this little present for me. I was like, oh, and it was a little diary with the little lock and key, and she said, so when you come home, you can write all your feelings down in this book. But it was she was tired of hearing me, but also it was a place you can put that. And I remember her saying, so you can keep it private. So it's like,
wow, that's huge.
Yeah, what a good point.
The idea of how fascinating of here's this beautiful place to write down your feelings. Wonderful. And keep them secret.
Yes. Because there
that
was
caveat
that stigma,
of,
because
it was just not talked about.
And you probably grew up with a diary as well.
I did. Mine didn't have a lock because I had a sister and brother and I assumed they'd get into it anyway. But I was the same. No surprise to you too. I was the talker and the feeler in the family. And so I wanted to talk everything out. And that wasn't necessarily the way with my sister and brother. But it definitely was okay to talk about in our household. And mine was pretty traditional. Mom was a stay-at-home mom for our early childhood. And my dad was a social worker. So it kind of, their jobs kind of lend themselves to talking and expressing and, but yeah, so from both of you, I'm wondering, how do you think the generation you grew up in shaped your thoughts and perceptions about emotions? So now we're thinking bigger picture, not just family, but what about the generation you grew up in?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd say my friends were very open about that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So, college especially was really the big eye opener because in high school you're a little naive. You're not.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're still very coddled.
Yeah.
When you get to college, you have your own thoughts and your own, things that you
Good
care
point.
about. And so getting there, it was like, oh, like first of all, your mental health kind of skyrockets in college, but having counselors and all that kind of stuff to guide you through all that, like I think college for sure was a big one where they were like, there are so many resources
Mm.
and
Wow.
they weren't too difficult to get, as long
Right.
as you kind of put some effort in and you're willing to go into it yourself,
Mhm.
which I think is a lot of people's biggest hurdles,
Well, and what a big difference from Amy, right?
Yeah.
Because you said at your high school or growing up,
Mm-hmm.
you would talk to the school nurse,
Yeah.
right? And certainly, that poor nurse is taking on physical ailments as well as,
Mhm.
Yeah.
the mental health piece. And then you're saying, well, those resources were available
Mhm.
and utilized.
Yeah, even this idea in your generation that emotions are something to process.
Mm,
Uh,
mhm. And yours are to hide,
Yeah.
Amy.
Not even have awareness or
Yeah.
acknowledgement. Maybe, and I should say that's like when I was in more elementary school, once I got in high school, maybe there was like, not necessarily a counselor, it's like your advisor, counselor person, but not a lot about feelings.
Mhm.
What about you, Becky?
The generational part?
Yeah.
I just think I find myself thinking about how it even changed from elementary school to middle
Mhm.
school.
Mhm.
As you're talking about college, Danielle, I'm thinking about nobody really shared that they went to therapy. I as a
Same.
therapist myself, now it feels almost like sometimes it's people openly talk about
Yeah,
the
for
fact that
sure.
they go, which is
Mhm.
amazing to me.
Yeah.
I have huge bias
Mhm.
that's awesome. But as a kid, even through college, that was if it was something that you did or sought out, it was not something to share with anybody. That was
Right.
something that there had to be a pretty big issue, and it was almost a recognition of helplessness in order to go do the thing. And how that shaped my thoughts and perceptions about emotions really are that emotions are this thing to endure and to get over. That emotions
Not
aren't
to sit
necessarily
in.
something to live with or to radically accept, as we frequently say in this day and age. There's something to get past, and they're almost thought of as a barrier.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. And that's a great point. And it's that piece to, for me, being a thinker and a feeler and a talker. I just remember my high school counselors. So like in the late 90s, everyone just saw, I knew who that person was, but people just went if you need to talk about college and things like that. Like you didn't
Mhm.
go if you felt sad, right? It wasn't even, anything. And then when my mental health journey kind of started, I still remember just going to my parents. Like it wasn't like you had said how you could talk with your friends about it.
Yeah.
That really wasn't the case until
Mhm.
obviously like as grown adults in our 40s we talk about it. But
Mhm.
yeah, growing up,
Well,
like
you mentioned
said,
last week on the show that we did, we
Yep.
talked about how you said this beautiful statement around you don't need to have a hardship in life to seek out therapy.
no.
It could be for gaining self-awareness or self-insight. We think about it that way now, but I'm pretty confident part of what you're saying, Amy, is that would not have been a thing. People aren't saying, I'm going to go to therapy to learn more about myself.
Right.
That isn't the way we thought about emotions.
No.
Yeah, and I was a little exception because, so then like in the 80s was when I was in high school. My parents divorced when I was 16. And so my first exposure to anyone going to therapy was my family went to family therapy
Mm.
Oh,
because
you
my parents were
did.
going through this
Okay.
divorce. Which when I look back, that's like, wow, who figured that out? I can't imagine my mother or father, but somebody did.
And
Maybe
you
it
don't
was the
remember
lawyers, I don't
who?
know, but
Of it.
but anyways, but it was my first exposure to therapy,
Yeah.
what it was about. And it's funny, right? Because I became a marriage and family therapist, and
Yeah.
I know that has a lot to do from back then.
Yeah.
But I was I didn't talk to my friends. We were going to therapy.
Okay.
It was just this thing we did once a week. And
Do you remember it
it's very
being
helpful.
what type of experience was it? Was it a good experience? It was
Absolutely.
to you. Okay.
Yeah. To I think our whole family it was difficult, but
Right.
and it makes me think about like, wow, I remember, not talking with friends about it. And I remember it was unique, even though there was a lot of divorce back in the 80s. I mean, that was kind of when people were getting, more divorces, I think, at that time period and 90s. And, of course, then later it was more popular to be able to talk about going to therapy. But back then, yeah. Definitely a
Yes.
stigma.
Well, that has me thinking, Amy. So because you've just lived more decades, we'll ask Danielle this too. But because you've lived you've lived more decades, how have you noticed the conversations and values shifting around mental health?
Yeah. I mean, and as a therapist, right? So when over many years of being a therapist, and when I first started out, I was working with teens a lot and kids, and but they were sad to come to therapy. They didn't want to be there. It was more of this like, oh, I'm embarrassed, kind of attitude.
A secret.
Yeah, a secret. And now I've got, teens calling to come in or, like, I think I have bipolar. I saw it on TikTok and, has all the examples of what mental health is. And,
they're bringing in the DSM-5.
Yeah. And everyone has a therapist, so they want one. And, and so it's such a shift over 20, 30 years here of therapy, that I've been a therapist, that it's such a change. And it's so good. I mean, it's so good that kids can feel like they can talk to their friends about it, and teachers and their school therapists and, all of that. But and I'm sure we'll get to this later, but I also think there is a lot of stress on kids compared to when I was, back in the day in the 60s and 70s, because I mean, social media to me is it can be a big stress.
Sure.
There's a lot of reasons why, but I mean, I think of bullying, I think of all the things kids are seeing online. And so there's the good about you can talk about mental health and what it's about and feelings and everything online, and their support and all that. But there's also this other side that to me is just the darkness that can take kids down.
Well, that's an interesting aspect to get you to weigh in on, Danielle, because part of what's shifted in the conversations in mental health are even what are the impacting or influencing factors that we didn't have to discuss certain things in the 80s or 90s as when I was a child and when Tara was a child, or things that we got to have a break from that are hugely resource giving in terms of maintaining mental wellness that I didn't even realize. I was just having this conversation the other day with someone around there is no getting away from not fitting in or belonging, because you can realize even the coolness that other people are posting in parties or sleepovers or get-togethers that I would have a break from if I didn't know I was included in on that. And the things that impact what allow us to feel a sense of belonging or connection to people, we didn't have the stress factor of that. So what would you say to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, social media is probably one of the biggest mental health drivers for my generation, I would say, for sure.
Okay.
Part of it is FOMO, kind of what you were saying. Like, we know when people are doing things, we know when we're not included.
Right.
And
where before you didn't, if you didn't get the paper invite handed to you, you didn't
right?
know.
Sometimes ignorance is bliss. And you can't have that. It's always, growing up, the only thing you want to do is fit in.
Right.
You want friends, you want to fit in. And then when you see people doing these kinds of things, you're like, oh my gosh, like, I'm not doing those kinds of things. Like, what does that mean about me? And then you go down that slippery slope of like, okay, your self-esteem, where's that at? Probably not great when you see all those kinds of things. And, I wasn't a partier. So seeing people partying in high school, I was like, I'm doing wrong. I don't know. Like, it was very interesting. And all you cared about were likes. Oh, it was horrible.
Even in high school.
Oh yeah. That was like the peak time for Instagram, all that kind of stuff. And it was like, all right, I'm going on this family vacation. All right, little brother, come take pictures of me. We're gonna do it for an hour. I'm not gonna enjoy anything because I need to get a picture to post.
Yeah.
It like just consumed you.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Well, and as you mentioned being a child, but even as an adult, we want to still fit in.
Yeah.
We want to have people who like us, who I can imagine that generationally, if that's also what your whole childhood was, because this is part of folks who are Gen Z grew up the entire time with social media. Your whole life has been an exposure to that. There wasn't a time that you didn't know that that's how people made friends or shared about their lives. And so you would be seeing, like, I thought we were really good friends. We just hung out. I didn't know you were going to be doing that today. Or you didn't say that you were going on this vacation, or you're hanging out with so-and-so. How come? And you never even said to me that you were. Those are things that we would just sort of trust relationships.
Right.
What we didn't know. If somebody didn't call us and tell us, we didn't understand necessarily what was in their decision tree on whether they hung out with us or not. But that doesn't stop when we become adults. That is a thing that is ever present around the generational component of who we become as an adult. And so I hear you saying, if the kids who grew up with having to take Instagram photos for an hour might still be adults who are taking Instagram photos for an hour.
Well, it's all you knew.
Yeah. No, and I know plenty of friends who still do that, and it's like, I think there's a little bit less, we need likes. You can hide those now, you don't have to worry about that quite as much, but it's still like, but I need people to know what I'm doing. I need them to know I'm doing this fun thing. I'm traveling. Like, it's almost like, how can I show people I'm cool still?
Right.
Even though, like, I think once you get older, you care a little bit less about it, but it doesn't go away.
But you still care. And that makes me so sad for your generation, in that, as someone who's worked with kids for 20 some years, I've seen it not just with, a wide age group it makes me so sad, and it makes me go, oh my gosh, I'm so glad we're old. Because like, we did have this beautiful idea of what we don't know is amazing, right?
Yeah.
Because we were protected by it. It was, we all wanted to belong, but it wasn't in our face how much we weren't belonging, or how disconnected we were, right?
Because you're so in the moment.
Yes.
You know, you don't, I was just telling you guys before we started, but that, there weren't smartphones. Wasn't personal computers until I was like in high school.
Yeah.
So in my childhood, it was, you're just, your mom would say, go outside, and you were out all day, and you're just in the moment playing with the friends in the neighborhood. You didn't know what was on the next block.
Which you're probably like, what are you talking about? Your parents just let you flee?
Yeah, literally.
All day?
Yeah.
Wait, I had my first phone when I was in second grade. I don't know what you're talking
Did
about.
you really?
Yes, I did.
Oh
Wow.
my gosh.
Part of it was, so my parents got divorced when I was very young. And so my dad moved to Iowa.
Oh, okay.
And so I got a little Motorola Corolla thing.
Okay.
So I could call him.
To communicate.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, but that's good. So it was for the it wasn't just
Yes.
here, have a cell phone. It was for the purpose of family and communicating.
Yes. I mean, I'm texted my friends way more than
Well,
I texted him, but
But that does speak to also the generational. You probably weren't unusual if you had friends to text.
Oh, yeah.
They also had a phone.
oh, I was not the first
Second
person to
grade.
have a phone. My neighbors kind of had a similar story. Their parents were divorced. Dad moved a little further away. They had a phone when they were super young. And I think that's why I was like, all right, Mom, Kate has a phone. I need a phone. So, yeah.
That's incredible. So you really, there's very few times in your life you remember without a phone, right?
Correct,
Without
yeah.
technology at your fingertips.
Yep.
Okay, so let me ask a question then to the group, because we're talking about kind of this like texting, what relationships mean. What in your generation did it look like to show up for someone who was struggling?
Oh,
What
great
did
question,
people
girl.
do to show up for someone else in your generation?
As children, as in
Any
high
age,
school?
yeah.
You pick.
Gosh.
Well, for me, it wasn't with phones, right? And
Were you
so-
sending out like smoke signals?
I know.
Because this is what made me think of it. Danielle's kind of talking
Yeah.
about texting people that
Right.
I just think about distress is so easily shared,
Right.
and that there's a pro and a con to that. Of you can meet someone in their moment
Yeah.
that you didn't have that, Amy. So
Well, right. I it makes me think about, again, kind of these neighborhoods and neighborhood friends. And I have dear friends I've known since we were in high school. But it would be get on your bike and go down to the park.
Mm,
And, somebody broke up with somebody. And so you're, someone's crying and you're talking to them sitting on the rock, or whatever. And like, just like being physically with people and connecting and finding them. It wasn't even calling.
And how did you know to go find them? Would you call each
Well,
other?
it'd be phone call, or if you saw them at school, and then let's meet here. But right, like then you're out and about and you're not connected unless you plan that.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that in my neighborhood, we just knew we played almost every day after school, and there was a meeting spot. And you would set your stuff down and you would go to that meeting spot and you would just sit there until other people showed up.
Yeah.
So that would have been an opportunity to offer support to somebody who, but they would have had to say it also.
Right.
Usually at school, because that's where you would, between classes at the lockers or lunch or something.
Yeah. And mine was in the hallway, right? Saying they're devastated or upset or the breakup. And then I would drive over with my shared car between my sister and I and bring like a treat or something like that. Or it was the passing notes, like, you know, I'd probably sitting in a class supposed to be focused, but I was like, I am so sorry for you and how devastated you must be with your breakup, fold it up into a cute little design and then pass it to that person in the hallway, right? Because it was, and we've talked about this before, Becky, with like notebooks or, you know, little notes we would write to our friends. Like that was the texting for our time, right? Where you probably had your phone and could text to a friend like, oh my gosh, you probably said OMG, you know,
probably during class.
Oh, for sure.
Yep. Meanwhile, we're like looking for the, you know, clock to hit and the bell to ring and run outside into the hallway to like connect with that person to get like,
during
did
the 5
you hear
minutes of
this?
passing time.
Oh my gosh. And then we can't be late. What a different, you know.
Yeah. So what would you say it looks like to show up for someone?
Yeah.
What did emotional struggle showing up for someone look like?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a lot of times it's obviously with people you trust that you can go through those things with.
Good point.
And, you know, for that, it's a lot of times you can do it a little bit more real time where you're like, hey, I'm going through this thing. Like, I need your help. Like, what do I say? Like,
Great words to put
what
to it.
you know, what do I do for this kind of situation? And so like my example was when I was breaking up with my boyfriend, you know, a few years ago. And like one of my best friends was with me every single step of the way.
Yeah.
Like she knew I was like, I'm unhappy. I don't know what to do. So she like walked me through it. She like sent me a text beforehand, like, let me know how it goes. That day she came over with some beers, you know, we were able to just hang out. It's like, it was very intentional.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of how I am too, where it's like, I want to be with you for every step of the way. And it's a lot easier to be with someone.
Yeah.
Right. And you can process together.
Yeah.
Where with Amy, you reflected together, but didn't necessarily get that in the moment processing with your people because you had to meet at the Rock. And,
Right.
You know,
It's a
hopefully
great
we talked about it at school, so you knew where to go.
Right. And just that piece of like you had to sit with it for a little bit by yourself.
Yeah. And I think there is this, you know, even in my generation, like today, you know, because you grew up in this place of where it was more private, or it was the family was like, you know, you don't talk about your feelings outside of the family kind of thing. You know, even today with friends, you know, it's like, Mom, let's go for a walk. We're kind of parallel walking, but it's not just all about the feelings that might come up in that conversation.
Yeah.
But it's
something I'm hearing from the dialogue right now is this idea therapeutically, we talk about reflection on action versus reflection in action, that generationally, you may be speaking, Amy, to reflection on action, things that have already happened. We tend to think of vulnerability now as reflection in action, that we're bringing people into the moment as it's occurring. And so things like, I'm going to share what's going on for me right now might be hard for people in your generation. It might be hard for people in your generation, Danielle, to exist through it alone without having people next to you. You don't want to have to reflect on action, or the skills around doing that, the distress that it creates is really high. And I hadn't really thought about it that way before, but how what's available in terms of coping strategies and what we get used to relationally would grow certain muscles around connection and depending on the generation that we grew up on.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it also plays into what you just said. And then going off of that, Becky, is that piece of, as you're both talking, I was like, wow, it would make sense, because what I've noticed generationally is with your generation, it's more instant gratification, satisfaction, because there's that sense of urgency because you're used to having it at your fingertips, right?
Yeah.
Where then with the older generations, we're used to having to reflect, sit with it a little bit more. So it doesn't have to be this instant thing for us, which is not the fault of the younger generation. It's that we gave you that access, right? We created something for you to have the power in your hand that like you can instantly have access to support, but also instant access to ways that make you feel less connected or more alone. And so it's that double-edged sword of
totally what serves us serves.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned this kind of stigma piece, Amy, but what I would love to hear from everybody around what you think barriers to seeking care for people in your age bracket are. Mental wellness in general, but barriers to seeking out care for that.
Yeah. I mean, it is funny because I keep coming back to technology too, but I am not very tech savvy, and I think my generation.
This is news to Becky and I, or to me and Becky.
But I've learned over the years, but it's not just automatic that I'm finding all the face groups, support groups, for client, your generation, Danielle, can just zip and look into all kinds of resources and Google all the
Great
things.
point.
And,
That is.
so some of that I think can be a barrier.
Because you're talking about just even knowing barriers to seeking care, knowing where the resources are, that there are so many support spaces via online groups, virtual groups where you're meeting people even all over the world. Definitely ways of seeking connection and validation of people who are experiencing your same thing, knowing that exists when you don't feel comfortable with seeking out the technology.
But on top of it, right, that you don't even maybe want to do that in the first place because you were used to just kind of dealing with things more on your own.
Yeah.
And just stigma of mental health issues, that in my generation, because it wasn't just talked about at all, that, even though as time's gone on, it's still hard to be comfortable with saying that you're having a problem.
Well, because that you experience decades of being told the opposite, right? It is a secret. It is something we don't
to
discuss.
lock up and hide the key. Yeah.
Well, and certainly logistical barriers around baby boomers would be at an age where there's physical health issues potentially, insurance coverage of mental health care, and the cost of it.
Right.
It's expensive. And if in a generation that it wasn't necessarily something that was prioritized, it's going to be really difficult for people to wrap their arms around. It's going to cost me this much money to go seek mental health care. That would be hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And even, I was thinking of some of the barriers too, and this might be a little more, but, as we get older and, not 60, maybe, but even 70 or, as we get older, our circle is smaller, we lose more people around us. Our parents are gone. Our,
just naturally it gets smaller.
Just naturally gets smaller circle. And so you're needing to create new connections, new friendships. And that's something when, this topic was coming up today, I thought for my generation and working with clients in my generation, seeking out new ways to have connections in community.
Very good point.
I never thought of that actually, how you just said, like you lose your circle, your inner circle. And so you have to build new relationships and connections, which, that would be challenging.
Yeah, Danielle, what would you say are barriers to seeking care for folks who are the Gen Zers?
Yeah, definitely some financial barriers where, we're still paying off student loans.
Yes.
We have all these kinds of things. You're probably not getting a ton of money where you're at. It's entry level, it's trying to figure all that stuff out. So I
how
think
expensive it is to just live.
100%.
And that mental wellness would be a cost that there just is not funds for.
Yep. And it's like that just comes second, it has to come second to all of the other things that you need to get by day.
Even with an insurance structure now of a system that's like high deductible plans that somebody says, I don't have another $3,000 to pay cash for healthcare. So I'm not going to do it.
Yep.
That makes total sense.
Do you find, kind of put you off the spot or on the spot about this. With you and your friends or you and your peers, was healthcare a big part of, you stated you're an actuary, a big part of taking on a job in that? Did you look to see like, okay, is this including, the mental health piece? Is that, a contributing factor on whether or not you take a job with your age group?
I would say no, unfortunately. A lot of
Really?
times
Okay.
it's like, I need that first job. That's kind
Okay.
of the big
Okay.
hurdle to get over. So my brother's trying to find a job. He's graduating college here soon. And even my parents are just like, you just need to find something. Doesn't matter.
Sure.
And so I
Okay.
think that's kind of what, unfortunately, a lot of people's, first take when it comes to,
Okay.
graduating and entering that new space in your life. But I also think, again, we do have more resources. So sometimes I think people are okay with just having a Google search. I think people have kind of just made that okay with the financial piece on top of it, where it's like, I can't afford therapy. I'm just going to watch a TikTok that tells me how to think through my feelings,
Wow.
And I think some people have just kind of relied on that and kind of moved to that frame of mind more so than seeking actual care.
That's a great point, which, it's before with us, we couldn't do that at all. It had to be a therapist, to be honest, because I wasn't even aware of like support groups, even if they were in person.
And everything did have to be in person.
Right.
So,
Yes.
part of what you're highlighting is that what works for us also doesn't work for us. That maybe the critical thinking around, if this is posted on TikTok, I'm just going to listen to it, whether or not I vetted the source. But even not that long ago, every mental health resource was effectively in person. It was unusual to find something other than online blogs or chat rooms that would offer a space for connection. And so I get how people would say, just even financially, well, I can't do this, but I can do this. And that does help.
Yeah.
It does help.
And it does, like you said, it increases the amount of people then that have access to it. I remember being a teacher and the pandemic hit. And I also had a degree in school counseling. And to me, I could wrap my head around teaching in an online environment. And then they asked me to be the school counselor online. And I was like, whoa, okay, so I'm going to talk about a student from kindergarten to 8th grade, their struggles online.
Yes.
And not get to use proximity and things that and it was such an adjustment, but now I can't imagine not having it. The fact that some of us sitting at this table have never met our clients in person. I mean, I have a couple clients I've never met in person.
Sure.
Because they're online.
Yep.
Yet I still feel like there's a very strong therapeutic bond. But the beginning of it, we have had this gift of we've lived through it, right? Where you've lived through, you probably lived through the idea of you went to school in person. And then all of a sudden one day you woke up and your parents shared, well, you're going to go to school virtually, right? So it's that idea of connection looked different, right?
Well, and one really beautiful thing about what Gen Zers offer, Danielle, is this idea that it sort of tests the rest of us who didn't have technology for our whole lives. You all are adults now, and you're saying, you know what? We can use the internet. We can text support to each other, or we can have a chat that is virtual and it can feel just as great as being in person. I think it is a gift that people who are coming into adulthood are offering those of us who are nope, it was this way, and that's the only way it's going to be. Kind of changes our worldview and expands our worldview to say, all right, well, mental health was one thing that worked for us and also doesn't work for us. We can learn from each other. And part of this discussion today has helped me see how if we share this, we can really learn from what the other generations have experienced. This has been amazing. So much to think about here. We're going to head to a commercial break, but when we come back, we are going to talk through our listener questions on the generational differences in mental health. It's going to be exciting, everybody. Feels Out Loud will process your thoughts in just a moment. We'll be right back.
Find your people, then you'll find yourself. You gotta find your people.
We are back again with Feels Out Loud, and this is the part of the show where we talk through questions from our fabulous listeners. If you have a question related to mental wellness, sharing feelings, or topics for each week that you would like us to process through, please visit our website at becomingtogethermn.com and find the Feels Out Loud page to submit a question directly or email us at contact@becomingtogethermn.com. We really do want to hear from you and what you are wondering about.
Tara, we got some cool questions today.
Yes, love.
Okay, we're going to start with Danielle on this one because I have a feeling that this is your lived experience, friend. This listener says, I work with people who are both older and younger than me, and we talk about mental health so differently at work than we did 10 years ago. I was just in a meeting last week where people openly discussed mental health, and I love that. But I could definitely tell that it was uncomfortable for some people in the room. How can we navigate these differences?
Yeah,
You relate to this.
absolutely.
You can.
There are definitely, especially working in insurance, it's a little bit
Yes.
stereotypical.
Yes.
And so, I mean, even just me joining the industry, I didn't realize like the difference between men and women. I was like, that was mind baffling to me. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm one of like 5 girls on this floor. This is crazy.
Wow, because it is a male dominated.
Definitely.
Yes.
But it's really hard to navigate those things because you can't make people comfortable talking about mental health. And like, if that's going to be where the differences lie, and obviously people are going to be uncomfortable about it, like, you just have to, I guess I don't even know how to find a way really to make people comfortable about it, except just by talking about it more.
Right.
Just keep
and
doing it.
You bring up such a good point because I love what you just said of you can't make people feel comfortable in that you're in a boardroom and you're getting ready for a meeting and there's people talking about it. You can't in those 2 seconds make that person feel more comfortable because you're speaking to the core of who they are, right? And generationally, if they're sitting there and they're closer to your age, Amy, they don't have any knowledge of, what it's like to easily talk about it.
Right.
So that would be really challenging.
Yeah. What would you say, Amy?
Yeah, because then growing up in my generation with the stigma and you keep it private and you don't talk about it. I have an idea here, just thinking leading with kindness, care, and curiosity, but also with the respect of privacy. Like something about like just that phrase to myself, in this kind of situation for sure, where it's people maybe you don't know at all and you want to just take that moment to just ask some questions, but also you can kind of read body language. If they're not wanting to go down that road, then you let it go. But asking questions and being a good listener.
Yeah. And that is so important. You bring up such a good point of respecting their privacy, right? In that, let's say the boardroom consisted of a lot of, 20-something-year-olds, whether male or female. Just because everyone else is comfortable doesn't mean that's the way it has to be, right? Well, you're wrong. You're not wanting to talk about it. So it's that idea of just respecting their values and who they are at their core, while also, like you said, being okay talking about it more. And maybe through that, they'll observe and develop a stronger comfort level.
Well, and that's also the hard thing too, where when you're in that kind of situation, if somebody's uncomfortable, hopefully it doesn't stop you still. There is still, obviously there's boundaries, right? But like, you shouldn't just be like, this person doesn't want to talk about mental health, I'm going to shut down.
Yeah. But just because it feels uncomfortable doesn't mean the content is bad.
Yeah.
Great reminder.
And my thought to this listener is to first recognize that there is a generational difference. That sometimes just naming the thing, and we've talked about this so much on this show, that just naming the thing gives it a different kind of power in our world to recognize this person grew up in a totally different circumstance than me with a different story. As you mentioned, Amy, a curiosity about that thing, but also fundamentally, there's going to be a generational component here. And to just feel that
Feel it. Feel the feels, girl.
Wow, we are at the end of our show already for today. Thank you so much for listening. Join us next week as we talk about meaningful ways to get to know one another and what real connection can look like. And in the week ahead, be kind to yourself. Remember that connection fosters wellness in everyone. Your voice is one that the world around you needs to hear. Please share yourselves, friends.
Some go, some will, some won't. I wanna